me, every Rosh Hashanah has always been exactly the same. The same rituals, the same places, the same foods. All right, so there's some small variety here and there. First, I was participating in youth programming when I was young, and then I was leading youth programming just after college. Some years I was there sitting in services, and now I'm here leading services. Some years I was at one synagogue, and now in another. So while my specific role and the specific building might change, Rosh Hashanah for me has always been basically the same thing. Spending a lot of time in a synagogue, singing the same melodies, and teaching the same ideas. Except one. There is one Rosh Hashanah that always stands out as being unlike any other I have ever experienced, and it took place exactly 20 years ago today. As we're all in the midst of experiencing a drastically different Rosh Hashanah from anything we've experienced, I want to share a little bit about my own different Rosh Hashanah from 20 years ago. During the fall of 2000, I spent my first semester of 11th grade living in Israel and participating in the Alexander Muss High School in Israel program. I've spoken about it before, but it's a program where, along with your usual high school classes, you learn basically all of Jewish history from the days of the Bible through modern-day Israel, or as much as can fit in 4 months, and you visit many of those important sites in person. Like many Israel programs, Shabbat is a highlight of the experience with a mixture of time spent together as a group and some free weekends where you have the opportunity to travel and spend Shabbat or holidays with family and friends. As Rosh Hashanah approached in that year, I didn't have a place to go for the weekend, so I made arrangements to spend the holiday with my teacher, Reuven. Reuven Spiro was my teacher for the core curriculum class, and so he was a teacher that I spent more time with than any other. Raised in Louisville, Kentucky, he made Aliyah as an adult and has been teaching at Muss for many years and is still there. Before I could spend the holiday with him, though, our staff told me that Reuven lived in Shiloh, a town in the West Bank. Now, since it was over the Green Line, they needed my parents to send a special permission slip saying it was okay with them. Now, while I knew what that meant, I didn't think much of it, and neither did my parents, who sent the form in right away. On Erev Rosh Hashanah, I took a van to Jerusalem with several other students who would be spending the holiday in the area. At the meeting point, everyone found their rides, and I was picked up by Reuven's friend who would drive me the rest of the way to Shiloh. While we were all getting in our cars, people were talking and saying something about the Temple Mount. I wasn't exactly sure why, but did know that Ariel Sharon, then a member of the Israeli Knesset, was planning to visit the site that morning. But since we're all in a rush to get ready for the holiday, the conversation didn't last long, and we all got on our way. Like many towns in the West Bank, Shiloh sits on a hilltop. Its name comes from the biblical site Shiloh, where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was kept before Jerusalem was established as the capital and the temple was built. There is a biblical site, Tel Shiloh, that sits just next to where the modern town is. After about 45 minutes or so in the car, we ascended a hill, passed a security gate, and came into Shiloh. A few minutes later, on the edge of town, overlooking the hill we drove up with a sweeping view of the surrounding area, we approached Reuven's house where he was outside waiting for me. He welcomed me quickly and said, "Can you give me a hand with something?" "Of course," I said. "I'm just finishing in the garden. We need to get all our planning done before the holiday begins, because with Rosh Hashanah, the new year, the Shemitah year begins tonight. Shemitah being the year when the land of Israel is supposed to lie fallow. And of all the ways I had imagined being busy on Erev Rosh Hashanah, finishing up in the garden wasn't one of them. Once we finished, we went inside and I met Reuven's family, his wife, and 5 children, all of whom were rushing around to get ready. Now this felt like the holidays that I was used to. But then Reuven mentioned that we weren't actually staying in his house for the holiday and that everyone was rushing and packing because we were going about 2 hilltops over, where there was a very small settlement, and we would help make a minyan for the holiday there. If Shiloh already felt different, this was now something totally else, something entirely different, something totally different. You get the idea. Up until that point, I had spent every Rosh Hashanah at home, at a large synagogue with upwards of 2,000 people in attendance. And now, here we were pulling up on a dirt road to a collection of little more than 10 trailers, again on a hilltop with beautiful views of the surrounding valleys. We gathered together for dinner that night in the one indoor space that could hold everyone. That's where all our meals were and also where we gathered for services. There, again, was a stark difference from what I was used to. This was a very traditional Orthodox service with separate seating for men and women and a more full liturgy than I was used to, with no kids or teen programming taking place and needing literally every man, everyone above the age of 13 to count for a minyan. It meant I was in the service the whole time. That was the first time I ever really read the Machzor and thought about the texts that make up our liturgy. It was the first time I really had a sense of the service and how it was structured. And without an officiating rabbi there, it was the first time I had to figure out when to stand or sit on my own, an important piece of knowledge, it turns out, a few years later. Like this year, the first day of Rosh Hashanah was Shabbat, so we spent that first day mostly around the table talking. After services and lunch on the second morning, we prepared to set out for Tashlich. Perhaps naively, I asked where we were going, only to have someone walk me to the edge of the hill and point out across the way, "You see that patch of white sand in the valley? We're pretty sure there's a spring there where the shepherds come to bring their sheep to drink. We'll climb down there for Tashlich." Once again, a far stretch from gathering with friends at a local park. And that difference was made even clearer as we set off on the hike and I looked around to notice I was the only person above the age of 15 or so who was not carrying a gun. To me, this seemed shocking. To everyone else, it was entirely normal. We climbed down to the spring and back up the hill easily enough, and then spent the last few hours of the holiday just enjoying our natural surroundings. As night fell, we packed into the car and drove back along the dirt road into Shiloh. And that's when things got interesting. We came back into town and drove to Reuven's house, where I was supposed to catch my ride back to Jerusalem. As we pulled up, he told me to wait in the car for a moment as he ran inside. When he came back out, he shared the news that everything had changed. After Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount just before Rosh Hashanah, protests erupted into riots that spread all across the country. The past 2 days had seen violence and conflict, and it was not safe to drive anywhere that night. I'd spend the night there, and we'd drive back to campus the next morning. We went inside and turned on the news to see what we now understand to be the beginning of the Second Intifada. Riots all across the West Bank and Gaza, clashes between Israeli soldiers and Palestinians, violence and lives lost, all within those 2 days. As we had been celebrating Rosh Hashanah on a hilltop, we were blissfully unaware of what was taking place not far away. I don't remember if I slept well that night, probably not. But I do remember that when Reuven woke me up early the next morning, he asked if I wanted to hear a funny story. Sure, I said, I could use a laugh about now. And then he explained that the Israeli army came to him during the night, asking to use the balcony of his house as an observation post. It had the perfect view of the surrounding areas. But in order to do so, they would have had to come through the room I was sleeping in. So he graciously denied their request. Thanks, I think. At about 5:30 the next morning, we set out on the road and everything seemed calm. As we pulled out of Shiloh, we stopped at the army's guard post at the entrance to town. The soldiers said something in Hebrew that was too fast for me to understand, but as soon as they finished, Reuven reached into the backseat of his car, picked up his Uzi, and put it on the dash right between us. Let's just keep this here to be safe, he said. What was going to happen in the next hour? Did we really need that gun sitting next to me? As he turned out onto the main road, he recited Tfilat HaDerech, the traveler's prayer, and I answered with an enthusiastic Amen. At first, everything seemed quiet. There wasn't much traffic and all looked normal. But after a few minutes, I began to notice some burn marks on the road. What are those? I asked. Reuven answered that they were probably burnt tires that had been thrown there the day before. We drove a little more and started to notice rocks all over the streets. At one point, Reuven had to quickly swerve the car to the other side of the road to avoid a boulder that had been thrown there the previous day. Riots, he said simply. That happened another 2 or 3 times along the road. Everything calm and quiet, and then suddenly approaching another site of boulders and burn marks. I don't think I ever felt unsafe on that drive, but each of those moments certainly felt uneasy. Finally, after about an hour, we pulled into the parking lot on the school's campus, where, grateful to see my friends again, I went back to my room for a well-deserved nap. My teacher was very understanding of why I was late to class that day. So that's my different Rosh Hashanah experience. By comparison, all of my other Rosh Hashanahs were downright boring. And yes, that includes the holiday I spent in Las Vegas. What happened there stays there. And the one in Dallas, where I began a sermon admitting to be an Eagles fan. I share this story as an example of what can come from a holiday that's drastically different. When I set out for Rosh Hashanah that year, I knew that I would miss certain aspects of my regular celebration, but I had no idea what to expect. I came back with vivid memories that still impact me 20 years later, and I continue to learn so much from that experience. As I said earlier, that was the first Rosh Hashanah I ever really read the Machzor and tried to follow along in the service. I still remember reading Hineni and Unatana Tokef and pausing to take in the majesty of their words. Ironically, sitting in a large service with a lot going on isn't necessarily the best place to just read the words that are in front of you. It might take a different, smaller environment to reflect on the words and consider their meaning. That Rosh Hashanah is also a regular reminder to me the importance of maintaining a personal connection to Israel. The Second Intifada remains a defining moment of Israel's history. Those 4 years were particularly difficult, with suicide bombings and terrorist attacks impacting everyone's way of life. The fact that I have even the smallest of connections, of a personal moment in those beginning moments, and then I experienced life on the ground during those days, continues to remind me of the need for all of us to maintain a strong relationship to Israel, both politically and personally. And this isn't just true for myself. Many of my peers who spent time in Israel during those years, including Naomi, continue to be shaped by our experience there. Having those memories of being in Israel at a difficult time have led many of us to be involved in a variety of Jewish communities as adults and taking on many leadership roles. It's also why it's important for all of us to find ways to stay involved and informed each and every year. That's why this year we're particularly proud of the Abraham Accords that Israel signed with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain just this week to normalize relations and enter into peace agreements. It's why these prospects of peace, something that often seems so far out of reach, were so inspiring in these past few weeks. It's also why we take this occasion each year to ask you to consider investing in Israel bonds. While we won't have a dedicated speech, I do want you to know that Jess Geller remains hard at work coordinating our Israel bonds drive and is always available to answer your questions, and I hope it's okay that I offer on his behalf that he is still happy to meet anyone for a cup of coffee and discuss it further. Just as a brief reminder, Israel Bonds is a major factor of Israel's economy and has expanded its goal to raise $1.7 billion in 2020. As the economy of every country in the world is battered by the pandemic, so too has Israel's economy been impacted. Let's join together as a congregation to show our concern, our love, and support for Israel. Israel Bonds is a good cause and an important mission, but remember, it's not a donation. You'll get your money back with interest. You all received a pledge card in your holiday gift bag, and I invite you to consider making an investment this year. When I began my own different Rosh Hashanah 20 years ago, I had no idea of the impact it would have on me. Now, do I think we'll come out of Rosh Hashanah this year with an international crisis on our hand? Well, with 10 hours to go, let's hope not. But we can all come out of Rosh Hashanah with memories that are just as vivid and of stories that we'll share with future generations about observing this Rosh Hashanah during a pandemic. It's an unusual feeling knowing that we are living through history, that history has its eyes on you. But living through history is passive. We sit back and watch as history happens around us. Instead, let's view this Rosh Hashanah as one on which we make history, taking every experience that is wholly unique and making it uniquely holy. For the past 2 weeks, we've been creating as many holy experiences as we can, from book clubs to cocktail nights, grade gatherings to gift bags. It's how a group of people wearing masks, standing outside a house or outside a synagogue, can be united by the sounds of the shofar. These experiences have all been different than anything we've done before, and I hope you'll join me in viewing them as part of the sacred, albeit different, high holiday experience. Yesterday, I spoke about finding meaning during the days of this pandemic, and particularly so on these holidays. While I don't know what specific meaning we'll be reflecting on 20 years from now, I pray we'll remember this Rosh Hashanah as a one-time experience, and one that we'll all have learned from, and one that we'll have taken meaning from, and one that will have many memories and many stories to share. Shana Tova.